The town square was bustling with the usual mid-afternoon noise. Children running past, horses whinnying, and a low murmur of gossip hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ava Calder stood outside the mercantile, clutching the tattered skirts of her faded dress. Her two children, Lucy and Samuel, tugged at her sleeves, their faces pale with hunger. They hadn't eaten since breakfast, and their stomachs ached with the kind of hunger that gnawed at your insides, slow and unrelenting. Ava, her hands shaking, turned to the shopkeeper behind the counter, desperation in her eyes. I can't pay today," Ava said, her voice tight with the weight of unspoken words. "Please, just a little credit for some flour. My children, they're starving." The shopkeeper didn't even look up from his ledger. "No credit, woman. You've had enough. It's bad for business. You should have known better than to fall behind on your debts." Ava felt her cheeks burn with shame, her throat closing up as she stared at the man, a man who once had some sympathy for her situation. Now, nothing but a stranger with cold eyes. She turned away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Her son, Samuel, tugged at her hand, his voice a whisper full of fear. "Mama, I'm hungry." Lucy, her 5-year-old daughter, clung to her leg, her tear-filled eyes pleading for a mother's comfort she couldn't give. Ava knelt to pull them closer, feeling the weight of their small bodies, their frail limbs. Then, a voice broke through the suffocating silence. Well, if it isn't the beggar, Trash herself." Lydia, May Sutton's voice cut through the square like a knife. Ava looked up to see Lydia May, the town's wealthiest widow, her lips curling in a sneer as she strutted past, her perfectly pressed dress rustling with every step. She came to a halt right in front of Ava, staring down at her with disdain. "Don't bring your shame near decent folk." Lydia May spat at Ava's feet, the thick, yellow spit landing with a wet smack. The crowd around them drew in a collective breath, and a ripple of laughter spread through the onlookers. Ava could feel their eyes on her, sharp as knives. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she fought the urge to run, to flee from their cruel glares. But there was nowhere to go. Her children's faces crumpled. Lucy began to sob, her small body trembling with the fear of being humiliated in front of all these strangers. Samuel buried his face in his mother's skirt. His voice choked as he whispered, "I don't want to be here, Mama." Ava's eyes blurred with tears, her heart shattering for the innocence lost in her children's eyes. She had nothing left to offer them but pain. She stood there, unable to speak, unable to move. It felt as though the weight of the whole town's cruelty had come crashing down on her, pressing her into the dusty ground. Just then, the sound of wagon wheels rolling over the dirt road pierced the air. The crowd fell silent as a shadow fell across Ava and her children. She looked up to see a tall figure, Ernest Boone, looming over them, his weathered face stern and unreadable. His black hat sat low over his brow, and the deep lines on his face spoke of a man who had seen much, lost much. The people around them parted, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ernest didn't speak right away. He simply looked at Ava for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning her face. Then, without a word, he turned to the wagon, hoisting himself onto the seat. He glanced down at Ava, his voice low but clear. "Climb into the wagon. Your children won't go hungry tonight." Ava froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. She stared at him, wide-eyed, her mind racing. What did this man want with her? What was he offering? There was no kindness without a price. There couldn't be. The whispers of the crowd echoed in her ears. "She's getting in Boone's wagon," they murmured. The town had long whispered about Ernest Boone, the widowed rancher who had a reputation for being a hard, cold man. They said he had no use for sentiment, no softness left after the death of his wife 3 years ago. Was this a trap? A kindness with strings attached? Her children's cries, their desperate hunger, broke through her thoughts. She could see the worry in their eyes, their tiny hands gripping her for comfort. There was no other choice. She had to protect them. Ava gathered all the courage she could muster and, trembling, climbed into the wagon. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The crowd's murmurs followed her, but she didn't care. The wagon lurched forward, and as it rolled down the dirt road, Ava's heart raced in her chest. She had made the choice. But what now? The silence in the wagon was deafening. Ernest didn't speak, and neither did she. Ava held her children close, trying to comfort them as the rhythmic sound of the wagon wheels on the dirt road filled the space between them. Lucy fell asleep against her side, and Samuel curled up with his head on her lap. The sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the prairie. Ava looked up at Ernest. His face was set in grim lines, and his hands gripped the reins firmly. He didn't offer her any reassurances, and Ava didn't ask for any. She didn't know what would happen when they reached his ranch, miles from town, but she was too afraid to voice the question in her mind. Her stomach turned with worry. She had come this far, but at what cost? Would she and her children be safe here? Would this man who had offered them food and shelter want something in return? And if so, what would it be? As the miles passed, her fear grew. They were leaving everything behind: the judgment, the whispers, the pain. But they were also stepping into the unknown. The ranch came into view, an isolated, well-maintained property that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The wagon rumbled toward the house, its weathered walls standing alone against the sweeping expanse of land. Ernest stopped the wagon, and without a word, he climbed down and came around to the side where Ava sat, holding her sleeping children close. He reached for them without asking, lifting her children from her arms with ease, one after the other, carrying them toward the door without a single word. Ava watched him, her heart racing. What was he going to do with them? Her mind was filled with unanswered questions as Ernest disappeared into the house with her children. She was alone, standing in the quiet evening air, with only the distant whisper of the wind to keep her company. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and fear. What had she just done? What did Ernest Boone want with her? The answers would come soon enough. But for now, all she could do was wait. Ava awoke in the soft warmth of a real bed, a bed with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell of dust and despair. The room was small but tidy, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a warm golden glow across the walls. She sat up slowly, feeling the unfamiliar softness beneath her and the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. For the first time in months, she wasn't cold or uncomfortable. She wasn't lying awake, trying to figure out how she would feed her children the next day, or where she would find the strength to face another day of ridicule from the town. As her eyes adjusted to the daylight, she saw her children sitting at the small table by the window, eating a hearty breakfast of eggs, biscuits, and porridge. Lucy was laughing, genuinely laughing, and Samuel was eating eagerly, his cheeks flushed with the kind of color Ava hadn't seen in him for far too long. It was a moment of peace that Ava could hardly believe was real. The kind of peace she'd dreamed of in the darkest nights, but had never truly expected to find again. And yet, here it was, in a house far from town, surrounded by silence and the soft hum of life that had once seemed out of reach. But there was still a nagging question in the back of her mind. Why had Ernest Boone done this? Why had he brought them here? She knew he wasn't some kind of saint. He had a reputation as a hard man, a man who lived with a sorrow in his eyes, a man who had once lost everything. What did he expect in return? As she sat there, feeling the warmth of the food in her belly and the quiet happiness of her children, Ava tried to push those thoughts away. For now, her children were fed. For now, they were safe. And that had to be enough. Ernest had given them this. So, when the door creaked open and he stepped inside, removing his hat with a quiet gesture, Ava was still caught in the trance of disbelief, as though she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. He looked at her, his stern face unreadable, before taking a seat across from her at the table. His voice broke the silence, calm but direct. "We need to talk," he said. Ava nodded. trying to steady the fluttering anxiety in her chest. Ernest's words were precise. No unnecessary explanation or small talk. He didn't seem like a man who wasted time on pleasantries. "I've been without help for too long," he began, his voice rough, though it wasn't unkind. "My housekeeper left last month. I need someone to run this house. And you need a place to stay, food for your children. I'm offering you work in exchange for room and board. You can stay here. Your children can go to school in town. It's a fair arrangement. No charity. Honest work for honest pay." Ava blinked, taken aback. This was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for some kind of hidden cost, some price she would have to pay in return for his kindness. But this was just work. Nothing more. It was the same thing she had done all her life. Worked for what little she had. The thought that she might earn her way here, instead of being treated like a charity case, struck her as almost too good to be true. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. A part of her wanted to question him, to ask why he was offering such an arrangement, but she was too tired, too grateful for the moment of relief that had washed over her. She simply nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. Ernest leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady. "It's not going to be easy. There's plenty of work to be done around here. I'm not asking for your charity, and I don't expect you to do more than what you're capable of. Cooking, cleaning, mending, that's what I need. And you'll be paid for it. A small wage, but enough to keep you and your children. If you accept, know this, I'm offering you a job, not a handout. And there's no room for weakness in this house." Ava was silent for a long moment, trying to digest the weight of his words. It wasn't much, but it was something real. Something that didn't carry the sting of shame. Something that could give her children the chance to grow up without the heavy burden of poverty and hunger hanging over their heads. But there was still that flicker of unease in her chest. "What happens when the town finds out?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ernest's eyes hardened slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching into something resembling a grim smile. "Town can say what they want," he replied. "They've been talking about me for years. When my wife died, they filled her grave with their lies. They don't care about the truth, Ava. They only care about what fits their narrative. I stopped caring what they thought when they buried Mary with those lies." Ava felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Mary. She had heard the rumors, of course. The whispers about how Ernest's wife had died, the hushed conversations that had followed her death. But there had never been any answers, just speculation, just the lingering sense that something had gone terribly wrong in that house. Ernest's words hung in the air, and Ava realized with a jolt that there was more to this man than she had first imagined. There was pain in his eyes, the kind of pain that never quite goes away, that settles deep in your bones and makes everything seem harder. She wanted to ask him about it, wanted to demand the truth, but she stopped herself. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Just then, the door swung open, and the sound of boots on wood echoed through the room. Sheriff Clay Hargrove stood in the doorway, his face drawn tight with suspicion. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him in months, not since the last time he had come by to remind her of her husband's debts, and the sight of him now made her stomach tighten. "Heard you took in the Calder widow and her children," Sheriff Hargrove said, his voice low and gruff. "What's going on here, Boone?" Ernest's expression didn't change. "I've hired a housekeeper," he said, his tone flat. "That's all." The sheriff's gaze flickered toward Ava, lingering for a moment longer than necessary, and then he turned back to Ernest. "A woman with questionable morals under your roof won't sit well with some people," he warned. "You know how it is. Town's already talking." Ernest's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Then they can talk," he replied, his voice hard. "They can stand and talk all they want, Sheriff. But I'll be the one to decide what happens in this house, not them." The sheriff hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Just watch yourself, Boone," he muttered before turning and leaving, his boots echoing on the wooden porch. Ava stood frozen in the silence that followed, her mind racing. She had overheard the conversation, and the weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. Ernest wasn't just offering them food and shelter. He was making a stand, and in doing so, he was risking his own reputation. For her children. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her gratitude and guilt pressed down on her chest. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was clear. Ernest Boone had given her more than just a place to stay. He had given her a chance to rebuild her life, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the kind of debt that came with it. The days passed, and Ava found herself settling into a routine she had not dared hope for. The ranch, though isolated and quiet, was a place of order, of purpose. Each morning, she woke early, just as Ernest did, and set to work preparing meals and tidying the house. The scent of fresh bread and sizzling bacon soon filled the air, a comfort Ava hadn't known in so long that it almost made her believe life could be good again. She worked hard, mending clothes and sweeping the floors, trying to stay out of Ernest's way while he worked the land, tending to cattle and the sprawling fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But there were moments of peace, too, like when she and the children would sit together at the table, the sun filtering through the kitchen window, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Lucy and Samuel, who had both been so thin and frightened when they first arrived, were thriving here. Lucy had started helping Ava with chores, collecting eggs from the chicken coop and dusting the shelves, and Samuel followed Ernest around, watching him as he worked. It was clear the boy was desperate for a father figure, and Ernest, in his own quiet way, was providing that. He showed Samuel how to properly clean tools, how to collect firewood, how to saddle a horse. It was more than Ava could have hoped for, more than she had dared to dream. There were small, tender moments, too, like when Ernest would fix one of Samuel's broken toys or sit with Lucy while she braided her hair. The gesture so gentle it made Ava's heart ache with an emotion she couldn't name. But even as the days turned into weeks, a nagging feeling grew inside her. She couldn't shake the sense that something was brewing just beneath the surface. There were too many whispers in town, too many cruel rumors about her, about Ernest. Every time she went into town for supplies, the shopkeeper barely acknowledged her, and the women turned their backs, whispering behind their hands. Her children, once welcomed by their peers, were now shunned, and Samuel came home from school one day with a black eye, the result of a cruel game some of the other boys had played. Lucy came running to her, crying, "They said you're a bad word, Mama." Ava had no idea what they were saying about her, but she knew it wasn't good. She tried to console her children, but the damage was already done. The next day, she went into town with her head held high, but it was hard to ignore the silent judgment that followed her every step. The women gathered in tight little groups, their eyes narrow with disdain, while the men simply looked the other way. And when Ava returned home, she found an anonymous note pinned to the ranch gate, written in bold, ugly letters. "Leave before you destroy another good man." Ava stood there, staring at the note, her fingers trembling as she tore it down. Her first instinct was to leave, to pack up and take the children and run, to spare Ernest the further humiliation, to protect her children from the venomous words of the town. But she couldn't. She couldn't go back to the life she had before, a life where hunger and humiliation were constant companions. She couldn't drag her children back into the hell of poverty, not when they had finally found a place where they could sleep without fear. That night, as she sat by the fire, feeling the warmth of the flames and the soft breathing of her children asleep nearby, she heard Ernest outside, working with the horses. Her thoughts were jumbled, a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't bear to see her children suffer again. She couldn't bear to watch them live in a world that treated them as less than human. Ernest came in later, his face tired but resolute. He saw the sadness in Ava's eyes and walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You've done nothing wrong," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "This isn't your fault." Ava looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in days. There was something in his eyes, something soft but guarded, as if he understood the weight of what she was carrying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." Ernest didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, his hand still resting on her shoulder, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled away and turned toward the door. "I'm going to town tomorrow," he said. "Stay here. Keep the children safe." Ava didn't know why, but something in his voice made her uneasy. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ernest didn't turn around. "I'm going to make sure this stops," he said. "No one will hurt you or your children while I'm still standing." The next morning, Ava watched through the window as Ernest rode out of the yard, his black horse cutting through the morning mist like a shadow. She didn't know what he intended to do, but she knew it was a declaration that he wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. She had never seen him this determined, this angry, and part of her was afraid of what might happen. She didn't know if he was strong enough to fight the town, but she knew that he would try. When Ernest returned later that day, he was alone. His face was grim, but there was a certain peace in the way he held himself. Ava stepped outside to meet him, her heart pounding. "It's done," he said simply. "They know what will happen if they touch you or your children again." Ava swallowed hard, not knowing whether to feel relief or dread. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ernest's eyes flashed with rare anger, his jaw tightening. "I went to the square, faced them all, told them I wouldn't stand for it. Told them if anyone harms you or the children, they'll have to deal with me." He paused, the weight of his words settling between them. "I bought supplies, paid double, and made it clear that you and your children are under my protection. If they don't like it, they can leave, but they'll stay away from you." Ava's heart fluttered, a mixture of gratitude and fear coursing through her veins. She wanted to say something, wanted to thank him for standing up for them, but the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, frozen, as he turned and walked toward the barn. The town would never let them be. Ava knew that now. But for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't powerless. Ernest Boone had protected her, and that act, however small in the grand scheme of things, had changed everything. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about fighting back. The storm came in the dead of night, its fury shaking the house to its core. Ava was already awake, her restless thoughts disturbed by the howling wind and the distant rumble of thunder. She had been lying in bed, listening to the storm's relentless assault on the world outside, when she heard the first sharp crack of lightning, followed by a blinding flash that lit the whole room for an instant. Her children stirred in their sleep, and she heard Lucy's soft cry cut through the noise of the storm. Ava rushed to their side, her heart tightening as she saw the fear in their eyes. Lucy, ever the brave one, clung to her, but Samuel was shaking, his small body trembling as he muttered in his sleep about storms and darkness and things lost. Ava pulled them both close, trying to soothe them, but the terror in their eyes mirrored the same fear she had carried for so long. "It's just a storm," she whispered softly, though her voice was thick with uncertainty. "It can't hurt you." But the words were hollow, for Ava knew too well how storms could take everything. Her husband, her life, her sense of safety. The wind howled again, rattling the windows, and Lucy sat up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Mama, the storm will take you too. Everyone leaves." Her voice broke with the weight of that fear, and Samuel, too, cried out, "Everyone leaves. Papa left." Ava's chest tightened with the weight of their panic. How could she reassure them when she, too, was afraid? How could she promise them safety when she had never felt safe herself? Just then, the door to the room opened, and Ava looked up to see Ernest standing in the doorway. His face was shadowed by the dim light from the hallway, but there was a softness in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he moved quietly into the room, kneeling beside Lucy and Samuel without a word. Ava stood frozen, watching as Ernest sat down on the floor beside the children, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the doorway. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply sitting with them, letting the storm rage around them. The sound of the wind and rain pressing against the house seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of Ernest's deep voice, calm and steady. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice a low rumble that filled the room, "my father would sit with me during storms just like this. He'd tell me that lightning doesn't kill, it feeds the earth. And the rain? The rain brings life, even though it feels like it's going to drown you." Lucy and Samuel both quieted as Ernest spoke, their wide eyes fixed on him, hanging on to his every word. The fear didn't leave them completely, but there was a shift in the air, a subtle change as they began to focus on Ernest's words rather than the storm outside. "It's not the storm that you have to be afraid of," Ernest continued, his voice softening. "It's the things you let the storm inside you. Fear could do a lot of harm. But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere. Not like your father did. I'm here, and I'll stay with you." Lucy, her small hands clutching the edge of his shirt, looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with a fragile hope. "You won't leave us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ernest's gaze softened, and he reached out to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "No, little one, I'm not going anywhere." His words, simple as they were, seemed to lift a weight from their small shoulders. Ava watched in silence, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she didn't want to name yet. It was tenderness, a kind of raw, unspoken affection that came from deep within her chest. She had never expected this from him, never expected Ernest Boone, the man who had lost everything, to offer them this kind of kindness, this assurance. But here he was, sitting beside her children in the dark, offering them the only thing she couldn't give them, the certainty that they wouldn't be abandoned. Ernest sat with them for a while longer until the children had calmed, their breath even and soft as they drifted back to sleep. When he finally rose, he gently lifted both children in his arms, carrying them to their beds without a word, tucking them in with the care of a father who had been doing it for years. Ava watched him from the doorway, her chest tight with emotion. As he finished and turned to leave the room, their eyes met, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. There was a rawness in his gaze, something unspoken that passed between them. He had not just helped her children. He had shared something with them, a piece of himself that Ava had never expected. "Thank you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Ernest nodded, his face serious but soft. "No need to thank me. It's what a man should do." He turned and left the room, and Ava stood there for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest, as if holding her heart in place. She couldn't explain the feeling that had washed over her, but she knew it wasn't just gratitude. There was something more, something deeper that she wasn't ready to face. As the storm raged outside, Ava sat by the fire, her thoughts a tangle of confusion and longing. She had come to this ranch to escape, to protect her children, and now she had something else, something she wasn't sure she could handle. Ernest's kindness had opened a door in her heart, one she had closed off a long time ago. But as much as she wanted to feel safe in that kindness, there was something inside her that recoiled at the thought of trusting it fully. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with a cost. But as she sat in the quiet of the storm's aftermath, her heart torn between fear and longing, one thing was clear. For the first time in years, she felt something like hope. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't safety, but it was something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. And that alone was a change. The morning after the storm passed, the ranch was eerily quiet, the heavy humidity of the night's rain hanging in the air, making every breath feel thick and close. Ava had spent the morning with her children, trying to push the memories of the night away, but the dread that had settled in her chest seemed impossible to ignore. The storm had passed, but in the distance, another storm was brewing, one she had known was coming but hadn't wanted to face. She could feel it in the air, like the way the sky shifts before the thunder rolls in. It didn't take long for that storm to make its way to the ranch. By midday, the sound of hooves approaching broke the quiet. Ava stepped outside, squinting against the bright afternoon sun, and saw Sheriff Clay Hargrove riding up the long path toward the house. Behind him were two other men she recognized from town, the Reverend Hutchins and one of the town councilmen, their faces pinched with disapproval. Ava's heart sank as she saw them approach, the weight of what was coming heavy in her chest. She stepped forward, her eyes searching for Ernest, but he wasn't in sight. Sheriff Hargrove tipped his hat as he drew his horse to a stop, the others following his lead. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, and looked at Ava with a cold, practiced expression. "Mrs. Calder, we need to speak with you," the sheriff said, his tone as formal as it was unfriendly. Ava's pulse quickened, and she swallowed, trying to steady her breath. She could feel the tension in the air, the same kind of tension that had filled the room when she'd first arrived in town, when the world had turned against her. She glanced behind her at the house, her children now peering through the window, their faces filled with curiosity and worry. She turned back to the sheriff and the others, her voice low but steady. "What's this about, Sheriff?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. He turned to the Reverend, who stepped forward, his hands clasped in front of him, his face a mask of concern. "It's come to our attention," Reverend Hutchins began, his voice almost too sweet, "that a woman like yourself, unmarried, with children, has been living under the roof of a man like Ernest Boone." The way he said "a man like Ernest Boone" made Ava's stomach turn, as if she were being judged for even existing in the same space as him. The town had never liked Ernest, not after his wife's death, and their whispers had only grown louder since she arrived. But Ava had hoped that, for once, she and her children might be able to stay out of the gossip. Apparently, that wasn't going to happen. The Reverend continued. "It's clear to all of us that the situation is improper. It's not just immoral. It's setting a bad example for the entire community. These children, your children, are being exposed to a sinful environment. You've made your choices, Mrs. Calder, but those children deserve better." The words hit her like a slap. She could feel the heat of shame rising in her chest, but she stood tall, not allowing them to see her stumble. "I'm doing the best I can to provide for them," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her heart. "And Ernest has been kind enough to offer us shelter in exchange for work. There's nothing improper about that." The sheriff looked at her with a grim expression. "The town doesn't see it that way, ma'am," he said, his voice low and carrying the weight of a threat. "The church is demanding action. The congregation has made it clear they won't stand for this any longer. We've spoken to the council. The children need to be removed from this situation. And you, Mrs. Calder, you need to leave." Ava's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, each one a blow to her fragile hope. "You can't just take my children," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. "They're mine." The Reverend's gaze softened, but only in the way someone speaks to a child who doesn't understand. "We're trying to protect them, Mrs. Calder," he said. "We're trying to protect your children from a life that isn't right. They can go to the orphanage, where they'll be raised properly. They won't have to grow up in a place where they're surrounded by temptation." The sheriff nodded grimly. "You have two options, Mrs. Calder. You leave now, and we'll make sure your children are sent to a proper home. Or you stay here, and we'll petition the court for their removal." His voice dropped, and Ava could feel the finality in his words. "You don't want to test us? Not with this. The judge will side with the church, and you'll lose them for good. Ava's heart was pounding in her chest. Her mind raced. She couldn't lose her children. She would rather leave everything behind than let that happen. But leaving meant going back to nothing. No home, no security, no chance. She thought of her husband, of all the choices he had made, the decisions that had ruined everything. She thought of the years of struggle, of watching her children go hungry, of living with the weight of debt and shame. It was all she had ever known. But now she was being given an ultimatum. What could she do? She looked over her shoulder toward the house, toward the life she had built here, the safety Ernest had provided. Could she really leave all of that behind? Could she really take her children and run again, knowing they'd face the same kind of life they'd left behind in town? The sheriff's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need an answer," Mrs. Calder. "The town's patience is running thin." For a moment, Ava felt utterly alone, trapped between two worlds, each with its own threats, its own dangers. But then a voice, Ernest's voice, cut through the tension like a blade. "She stays," Ernest said, his voice low but unwavering. He had appeared from the shadows of the barn, his tall figure casting a long, imposing shadow across the dirt yard. "She stays, and her children stay with her. They're under my protection, and if anyone tries to take them from her, they'll have to go through me first." The sheriff's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he didn't move. He stood there, silent for a moment, before speaking again. "This won't be over, Boone," he warned. "You'll regret this." Ernest didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, "but I won't regret protecting them. And neither will she." Ava looked between the men, her heart racing, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the storm that had passed through the night before. She could feel her hands trembling at her sides. But in that moment, with Ernest standing by her, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let them take her children. She wasn't going to let the town tear apart the one good thing she had found. "We'll stay," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that churned inside her. "We'll stay." The night after the council's ultimatum had left Ava shaken, she found herself sitting on the porch under the cover of stars, the night air cool against her skin, but the heat in her chest was anything but. Her thoughts, still tangled from the morning's confrontation, refused to quiet. Her children had settled into their rooms, the house once again filled with an eerie calm. Yet Ava's mind wouldn't stop racing. Ernest had stood firm, his words carrying weight, but she could still feel the echo of the town's condemnation, the pressure of their judgment hanging over them. She hadn't been able to ask Ernest what he was thinking or what he was planning, but tonight, the silence between them had been too loud. She needed to understand what was behind his quiet strength, why he had so willingly put everything on the line for them. And so she had asked him, her voice barely above a whisper, "Why did you help me that day? What made you offer a shelter when no one else would?" Ernest had been standing at the edge of the porch, his broad figure silhouetted against the horizon. But at her words, he turned and walked toward her, sitting down beside her on the old wooden steps. The weight of the moment pressed against them like the darkness around them, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ernest sighed, the sound low and heavy, and then began, his voice quiet but steady. "When my Mary died, it was like the light left me." He began, his words almost a confession, a soft burden between them. "We were young when we married, and it was a good marriage, full of love, full of hope. But when she died, I couldn't see any reason to keep going. She died in childbirth, during a storm just like the one last night, and the baby, a son, didn't make it either. I held her in my arms as she passed, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do. The doctor was too drunk to come. The storm was too bad. I buried them both on the same day, in the same grave, and the town didn't care. They said I was too cold, too distant. They blamed me for her death, for the baby's death." Ernest's voice faltered slightly, but he didn't stop. Ava sat silently, her heart breaking for him, for the pain he had carried in silence for so long. "I stopped living after that," he continued. "I buried myself in work, in the land because that was all I knew. But when I saw you in that town square, standing there with your children, with no one to help you, it was like a part of me remembered what it was like to care, to want to do something good again. His eyes met hers then, raw and honest. I wasn't looking for redemption, Ava. I wasn't looking for someone to save. But when I saw you, I knew I had to do something, even if it meant risking everything again. The words hung in the air, heavy with grief, with understanding. Ava felt a lump form in her throat as she listened, her mind struggling to process what he had shared. She had come here for safety, for refuge, but she had never expected to find someone like Ernest, someone who had lost so much, and yet still found a way to offer others something he had long given up on for himself. His quiet strength, his ability to protect without asking for anything in return, was something she could never have imagined. "You think I don't see it," Ernest said, his voice softer now, as if speaking more to himself than to her. "But I do. I see how much you've suffered, how much you've given. You've done more than anyone should have to. And I admire you for it, even if I don't know how to show it." Ava blinked, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. It was a side of him she hadn't allowed herself to notice before, the side that wasn't just the hard rancher, the stoic man who lived alone in the wilderness. He was more than that. He had a depth, a history of pain and survival that made his kindness all the more powerful. "I didn't ask for anything," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. "I never wanted to owe anyone. Not like this. I never thought anyone could be kind to me without wanting something in return." Ernest reached over, his hand brushing hers lightly, the contact gentle but grounding. "You don't owe me anything, Ava," he said firmly. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a chance, the same way you gave your children chance. I'm not asking for anything but the chance to help, to be part of something that matters." Ava's breath caught in her throat as she met his eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt something stir in her chest, a mix of hope and fear, of something unspoken and powerful. The connection between them, the understanding that had grown between the cracks of their shared silence, was undeniable. Yet it wasn't simple, wasn't easy to label. She was still unsure of what to call it, but she knew it wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that had been awakened in both of them. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, Ernest stood up, brushing his hands on his pants, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need to go," he said, his voice tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "There's someone I need to speak to, someone I should have spoken to a long time ago." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the barn, disappearing into the shadowed doorway. Ava sat there for a long time after he left, her mind reeling from what he had shared. She had never imagined that a man like Ernest, someone so guarded and isolated, could be so open, so vulnerable. And yet, here he was, offering her more than she had expected from anyone. His words had broken something open in her, something she had kept locked away for so long. As she stood and made her way inside, a quiet thought crept in her mind, one she hadn't allowed herself to entertain before. What if there was something between them? Something more than just kindness, more than the simple act of providing for her and her children. What if this was a beginning? The thought terrified her, but at the same time, it filled her with a strange kind of hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or whether Ernest's actions had changed anything between them. But as she lay in bed that night, her thoughts on him, on his words, she felt a shift in her heart, a tentative spark of something new. And she wondered, just for a moment, if the future they were both so afraid to imagine might be closer than either of them realized. The day of the wedding had arrived quietly, almost too quietly. Ava stood in front of the small mirror in her modest room, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the hem of her only good dress, now mended and clean. The dress was simple, nothing fancy, but it was the best she had, and today it was all she needed. She had thought about this moment, this decision, more times than she could count, but now that it was here, it felt surreal, as though it were happening to someone else, to a woman in a story far removed from her own life. The children had helped, picking wildflowers from the field to make a small, mismatched bouquet for her to carry, their excitement infectious despite their limited understanding of the significance of what was happening. Lucy was bubbling with joy, her small hands pressing flowers into Ava's grasp, while Samuel stood off to the side, his face serious but his eyes full of unspoken hope. Ava felt a pang of tenderness as she looked at them. This was the life she had promised them, a life of stability, of safety, and somehow, despite all the odds, they were getting it. But as she stood there, the weight of Lydia May's earlier accusations still heavy in the back of her mind, Ava felt the sharp edge of the town's judgment once again, the whispers that would no doubt follow her as she made her way down the makeshift aisle beneath the oak tree. It was the same oak tree where Ernest had asked her to marry him, the same tree where she had thought about all the reasons she should run, all the ways she could leave the safety of this life behind. But now there was no more running. She wasn't just choosing Ernest today. She was choosing her children's future, choosing this family, this new beginning that she had been too afraid to believe in. When she stepped outside, her heart skipped a beat at the sight of Ernest, standing by the tree, his broad shoulders straight, his gaze fixed on her with such intensity that it made her stomach flutter. He was waiting for her, not with the same fear that had gripped her for so long, but with a steady, quiet certainty that somehow calmed the nerves that had threatened to overwhelm her all morning. He looked the same, and yet so different. There was no trace of the man who had once walked through the world with a shadow of grief hanging over him. Today, he was fully present, as if he had come alive again in ways Ava hadn't even realized were possible. When he saw her, his expression softened, and for a moment, there was nothing else in the world except the two of them standing there, under the oak tree, a family made out of necessity and choice, out of pain and hope. The small gathering of friends and neighbors, people who had stood by them through the worst of the gossip and judgment, watched silently from the edges of the yard, their faces a mixture of curiosity and support. Sheriff Hargrove was there, surprisingly, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, and even old Tom Briggs, who had officiated their informal arrangement in the beginning, stood at the ready to marry them today. The ceremony was simple, but to Ava, it felt monumental. The vows they exchanged were not just promises to each other. They were pledges to the future they were building, to the children who had come to call Ernest Pa, to the life that was still fragile, but somehow real. Ernest's vows were steady, sure, the words coming from a place deep inside him, as if they had been there all along, waiting to be said. I vow to protect you, not because you need protection, but because you are precious to me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I vow to be a father to your children, to love them as my own. I vow never to let anyone make you feel less than worthy. And I vow to wake each day grateful that you chose me. Ava's voice was quieter, but no less full of conviction. I vow to make this house a home, she said. I vow to honor your past while building our future. I vow to choose you every day with open eyes and full heart. And I vow to teach our children that kindness is strength. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate speeches, just simple, honest promises made before a small crowd who had come to understand that love, true love, wasn't something that could be measured by the standards of the town or the expectations of others. It was something that was built slowly through sacrifice, patience, and unwavering devotion. When they exchanged rings, Ernest's mother's ring slipped easily onto her finger, the simple gold band a reminder of a love that had been tested by time, by loss, and by distance. For Ernest, the ring that had once belonged to his father was placed on his finger, a quiet symbol of the life he had once known and the life he was now choosing. The small crowd clapped gently as old Tom declared them husband and wife, and without thinking, Ava stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Ernest's lips met hers in a kiss that was soft at first, testing the waters, and then deepened, a kiss that spoke of more than just this moment, more than just this ceremony. It was a kiss that held the weight of the future, a promise that they would face whatever came next together. The children rushed forward, giggling, and hugged them both, their faces beaming with joy. Samuel's voice cracked as he asked, "Can we call you Pa now?" Ernest's throat tightened, and for a moment, Ava thought he might not be able to answer. But then he smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd be honored, son." The small celebration that followed was quiet, but filled with laughter and warmth. They ate together, the children running and playing in the yard, the ranch hands joining in to celebrate the new family they had become. As the evening drew to a close, Ernest lifted Ava in his arms, carrying her over the threshold of their home, their first night together as husband and wife. It felt like the beginning of something real, something whole, and for the first time in a long time, Ava felt peace settle over her. The future wasn't perfect, it wasn't without its challenges, but it was theirs to shape. In the months that followed, they found themselves adjusting to the rhythms of family life. Spring came, and with it, a new chapter. Ava's belly began to swell with the promise of new life, and their small family grew even stronger. Samuel, now firmly settled into the idea of having a father, worked alongside Ernest, his proud voice calling him Pa more and more each day. Lucy helped Ava in the kitchen, her joy infectious, and their laughter filled the house. The town, once so quick to judge, moved on to new gossip, with Lydia Maison's scandals now the subject of whispered conversations. Some townspeople, slowly, came to apologize. Others didn't, but it didn't matter. Their family was whole. Their love was real. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, Ernest and Ava sat on the porch together, watching their children play in the yard. The weight of all they had been through, all they had survived, seemed to lift with every passing day. Ernest leaned back, his hand resting on Ava's swollen belly. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ava smiled, her heart full. "We saved each other," she replied. Together, they watched their children, their future, and their family grow stronger with each passing moment. And as the sky turned from pink to purple, Ava knew that the past, with all its pain and loss, had led them here, to this life, to this family, to this love. It was a life she had never imagined but had come to cherish more than anything. They spat at my feet in the town square. Ava's voice echoed in her mind, the words now full of resolve. He said, "Climb into the wagon. Your children won't go hungry tonight." I thought he was offering charity. He was offering a future. And as she looked at Ernest beside her, she realized the truth in his words. He had not just saved her children from hunger, but had offered them the possibility of something greater, a reason to believe in tomorrow. Together, they had built a life from nothing, and together, they would face whatever the future held.